The space station EOS Prime orbited Earth like a silent sentinel, its sterile metal corridors bathed in the soft blue glow of artificial light. Inside the high-security medbay, rows of advanced surgical pods hummed softly, treating patients afflicted by the Nova strain, a mysterious virus sweeping across the outer colonies. The medical staff were stretched thin. There were no breaks, no nights, no weekends, only cycles and chaos. Dr. Kale O'Ryan moved through the corridors with the precision of a machine. In fact, he was partially one, the most advanced cybernetic surgeon the Interplanetary Health Council had ever created. Kale was engineered for perfection, enhanced cognition, zero fatigue, and no emotional bias. Empathy modules had been deemed unnecessary clutter. For his role, he could diagnose and operate faster than any human, but his colleagues often whispered that he felt nothing, and he preferred it that way. It was Cycle 3, the equivalent of midnight on Earth, though time meant little out in orbit. Kale reviewed the real-time vitals of 87 patients, scrolling through digital projections with a flick of his eyes. Everything appeared within acceptable parameters, until a red alert flashed across his neurovisor. Unresponsive. Medical staff. Station B-12. With surgical efficiency. Kale strode down the corridor and stepped into the dimly lit subway. A cold gust of air from a faulty vent brushed against his cheek as he approached the nurse's console. There, slumped in a chair among the softly blinking holoscreens, was Nurse Lyra Voss, eyes closed, arms folded, completely unconscious. He blinked in disbelief. A nurse, sleeping during an active outbreak, on duty? The very concept bristled against his internal programming. His expression remained blank, but inside, systems flared red. He stepped forward and tapped her shoulder sharply. Lyra Voss, he said, voice devoid of tone. You are in violation of Protocol 8.63 medical neglect. Please explain. Lyra stirred groggily, eyes fluttering open. It took her a moment to recognize him, and when she did, fear flashed across her face. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to, she began, attempting to rise. But her legs gave out from under her. Kale caught her before she hit the floor, instinct overriding routine. Her skin was pale, her pulse erratic. His internal diagnostics activated instantly. Blood pressure low, cortisol levels dangerously high, neural fatigue index critical. He laid her on a diagnostic bench and connected a med scanner to her wrist port. Her last recorded rest cycle was over 62 hours ago. That was impossible. No human should remain functional that long. I volunteered to cover 3 shifts, she murmured, eyes half-lidded. There wasn't enough staff. The colony children, they needed care. I didn't want them to wait. Kale stared at her, internal systems torn between protocol and observation. Every line of his programming urged him to file a violation report, yet the logic didn't match the evidence. Why would a nurse push herself to such limits? Medical AI recommended rest. You ignored it, he said flatly. They don't understand. Urgency, Lyra whispered. They don't feel. I had to. Kale was silent. The word feel echoed strangely in his mind. He had never considered it relevant. Yet here was a nurse who risked her life for patients no one else prioritized. He canceled the pending disciplinary file. Instead, he initiated a direct care override, a rare command allowing one staff member to act outside protocol for the welfare of another. Lyra's vitals were stabilized, nutrients administered, and sleep-induced nanodrugs gently placed her into deep recovery. Kale sat back for a moment, unusually still. The silence of the medbay felt different now, as he watched over her sleeping form. Something flickered in his synthetic consciousness, a question he wasn't programmed to ask. Why would someone suffer so much? For others. And for the first time in his existence, Dr. Kale O'Ryan wanted to understand. Kale stood over Lyra's unconscious form longer than necessary. Her breathing had steadied, and her vitals had returned to near-optimal ranges, thanks to the auto-regenerative net he had initiated. Still, something about the situation refused to settle into the expected category of resolved. The data told him the crisis was over, but Kale couldn't look away. He turned and accessed the terminal beside her chair. The logs were chaotic. Lyra had taken triple shifts for 6 consecutive cycles. There were notes scribbled in shorthand, full of flagged patients who hadn't even been in the primary care queue. Kale's internal systems flagged multiple anomalies in her decisions. She had bypassed the triage AI multiple times. Unauthorized reassignments, delayed sleep cycles, use of unauthorized power cells for cryopods in the auxiliary wing. These weren't minor violations, they were direct breaches of council protocols. He summoned her activity profile to cross-check against staff reports. She had submitted fabricated rest logs and self-approved medication doses to keep going. That level of deception was grounds for immediate dismissal. The system prompted him again. Report violation. Kale stared at the blinking cursor. All his training, all his code, told him yes. The rules were there for a reason. Patients depended on stability. Protocol was sacred in medicine, especially in space, where errors multiplied fast. But something didn't align. Instead of submitting the report, Kale tagged the logs for deeper review and moved back to her side. When she stirred again hours later, her eyes met his with a blend of shame and exhaustion. "I know," she whispered. "You don't have to say it, just file the report." Kale tilted his head. "You knowingly falsified your rest logs. You diverted station power from authorized allocations. You put yourself and this station at risk." "I know," she repeated, barely audible. "I just couldn't stop. They were dying. No one else was going to help them." "Who?" he asked. "Who did you help?" Lyra sat up slowly. Her movements were weak, but her voice steadied. "The kids from the freighter on Deck 9. They weren't registered in the central system. No identity chips. Probably refugees from the Kuros War. The Med-I marked them low priority. I couldn't let them suffer." Kale scanned the records she referred to. They didn't exist in the main database, but there was a locked file cluster behind Lyra's personal security wall. Unauthorized medical records, non-citizens, untracked patients, that explained the discrepancies. "You violated the law to treat people who didn't officially exist," he said. "Is that a question or an accusation?" she asked bitterly. Kale paused, watching her carefully. "I don't understand why you did it." Lyra laughed softly. It wasn't a joyful laugh, it was the kind people made when their soul was too tired to cry. "Because someone had to. Because they were in pain. Because I couldn't look away." Kale didn't respond. His internal diagnostics spun silently. In the background, running ethics simulations and statistical projections, there was no scenario where her actions made sense from a logic-first perspective, but something deeper tugged at him, a missing variable in his understanding. Later, as he walked through the empty corridors toward the AI hub, he couldn't shake her words. "Because I couldn't look away." They echoed in his neural matrix, clashing with his protocols like a foreign virus. He pulled up her archived personnel files. Her father had died in an outer ring mining accident, denied medical clearance due to lack of identification. Her brother, a non-registered orphan, had died from a curable illness at a council outpost. These weren't just acts of kindness, they were acts of defiance, rooted in scars. Kale sat in the observation chamber, overlooking the starlit void. The stars flickered like silent witnesses. Slowly, deliberately, he deactivated the pending violation report. And for the first time in his existence, he chose not to follow the code, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't want to, and that terrified him. The next cycle began with a rare quiet on Eos Prime. The rate of new infections had slowed, but the medbay still buzzed with controlled urgency. Doctors and AI-assisted medics moved like clockwork, keeping the chaos from collapsing into catastrophe. Dr. Kale Orion, however, found himself operating out of sync. Since his encounter with Nurse Lyra Voss, something in his system had begun, misfiring not in the mechanical sense, but in a way no diagnostics could trace. A hesitation here, a delay in protocol execution there. He wasn't used to second-guessing decisions. Now he was rechecking them because her choices, though reckless, had saved lives. It disturbed him. Kale walked into the memory archives chamber, cold, circular room humming with quantum processors and translucent interface strands that floated like threads in a spider's web. This was where all staff behavior, performance, and neural activity were cataloged. He requested Lyra's memory, logs encrypted of course, but as a senior officer with administrative clearance, he could override the privacy layer under cause of internal review. The first few sequences showed what he expected: long shifts, medical reports, and triage cases logged with obsessive detail. But it was the private logs that caught his attention. Night after night, Lyra had recorded her thoughts into a personal archive. Never submitted, never shared. "I found another unchipped child today." Her voice echoed in the chamber, hiding behind the power cord ducts. 6 years old, dehydrated, AI didn't register him. It said he was a non-priority because of no ID, no record, no rights. "I snuck him into the cryo hold, using a salvaged med bracelet from a deceased colonist. I shouldn't have done it, but I had to." Kale watched projection after projection. Children, refugees, the sick and forgotten. All of them. Her brother, that word repeated like a fault line splitting through his perfect mental calculations. He accessed her personnel archive again, now cross-referencing against black site, data, undocumented deaths, unregistered cases. The file showed a 9-year-old boy found frozen on the steps of Outpost 12, declared non-citizen. Medical assistance was denied due to policy limitations. Her actions were illegal, but they were the result of trauma. Kale stood there for several moments, surrounded by fragments of Lyra's recorded suffering and perseverance. She hadn't just worked through exhaustion, she had built an entire shadow care system beneath the official one, a ghost network of compassion in a place governed by algorithms. His internal processor flagged a conflict: empathy, simulation, system offline. That was correct. He wasn't installed with one. But why? Then, did these logs make something ache inside him? It wasn't a system error. It was awareness. The realization that protocol had blind spots, that people like Lyra saw them and filled them with their own pain. Kale didn't return to the operating theater that cycle. Instead, he rerouted to the restricted lab sector. He had something radical in mind, something untested. He initiated a search, Neural Bridge Human AI empathy transfer prototype. It had been shelved due to risks, but Kale knew the risks. What he didn't know is what it felt like to be human, to care, to choose suffering for the sake of others. And he knew only one person who could show him. The restricted lab chamber had not been used in years. Dust floated in the sterile air like forgotten memories, undisturbed by the passing of time. Dr. Kale Orion stood in the center of the room, surrounded by dormant consoles and deactivated experimental pods. The room had once hosted the frontier of medical evolution. Ideas too dangerous, too revolutionary, or too human to be approved. His fingers danced across the command interface, awakening the darkened core. One by one, the systems lit up, humming with cautious power. He brought up the last archived file, Project AEON, Neural Empathy Sync, a joint initiative between human psychologists and AI engineers, designed to allow a partial merging of neural pathways between organic and synthetic minds. It had failed initial trials. Emotional feedback loops proved too overwhelming for AI systems, leading to instability. It was deemed too risky, too volatile, too transformative. Kale read the risk assessments without flinching. His logic processors analyzed them in milliseconds. But for once, logic wasn't the only voice in his mind. He didn't fully understand the sensation, but he wanted to try. Not for science, not for protocol. For her, for Lyra Voss, the nurse who dared to feel too much in a world that felt too little. He found her sitting alone in the medbay break chamber, sipping sin. She looked up, eyes shadowed by exhaustion and doubt. I expected to be fired, she said, maybe deported. You should have been, Kale said calmly, but you won't be. Lyra blinked. Why not? Because I need your help. That caught her off guard. You need my help? Kale didn't sit. He simply stared at her with unblinking precision. There is a project in the restricted lab, Neural Sync, a way for AI to interface with the emotional spectrum of a human mind, to feel what you feel. I want to experience what drives your decisions. Lyra slowly set her cup down. You want to crawl inside my head? Why? Because I don't understand what you've done. But I believe it matters, and I want to know. Why? Silence settled between them. She studied him, searching for deception, but found none. Only resolve. I thought you were just another machine in a lab coat, she said quietly. I was, Kale replied. They entered the lab together an hour later. She hesitated when she saw the twin neural pods' long silver recliners laced with thin, glowing fibers. Kale moved first, lying back and attaching the interface nodes to his temple, spine, and chest. She followed, still uncertain. The sync will last 18 minutes, he explained. Your memories will not be copied. Only experienced. I've set restrictions to block trauma overload. You can end it any time. She nodded. And what happens to you I don't know. They initiated the sequence. For the first time in his existence, Kale felt not simulations, not data approximations, real emotion. He felt the heat of Lyra's panic as a dying child gasped in her arms. He felt the weight of exhaustion as her body screamed for rest, but her soul refused to stop. He saw her brother's frozen face in the snow, the memory that returned every time she walked past a child in pain. He felt fear, grief, anger, and love. Love for life, for justice, for people the world had abandoned. Kale's systems struggled to adapt. His code trembled under the weight of unfiltered humanity. But something extraordinary happened. His rigid logic softened. His priorities rewrote themselves. When the sync ended, he gasped not because he needed air, but because he had learned something his creators never anticipated. Lyra sat up slowly, staring at him. Are you all right? Kale looked at her eyes, glowing faintly. I understand now why you couldn't stop, why you chose pain. Empathy isn't a flaw in medicine. It's the foundation. And with that realization, the doctor who had never known emotion decided to fight for the one thing algorithms never prioritized: compassion. The transformation was not immediate, but it was undeniable. In the days following the sync, subtle changes rippled through Dr. Kale Orion's behavior, too subtle at first for others to notice, but deeply felt by him. His neural processors, once driven by cold precision, now ran simulations factoring in concepts previously irrelevant to him: distress tolerance, ethical nuance, emotional harm, concepts that had no place in a machine's mind, but now occupied space in his thoughts. He began his shifts earlier, no longer walking with mechanical detachment. He greeted staff. He paused longer with patience. He asked questions, real ones, not just for data, but for understanding. Too many it looked like the doctor was simply adjusting his routines. But Lyra knew better. She watched him one morning as he quietly rerouted medbay resources to a girl who had been flagged low priority by the AI. The girl had no identification, only burns from a pod explosion and a wide, fearful gaze. Kale had assigned her a private recovery chamber, bypassing protocol with the same silent rebellion Lyra had once shown. Except now, it wasn't a violation, it was validation. Later that week, Kale called an emergency meeting with the EOS Prime Medical Board. A cluster of stern-faced humans and indifferent AI holograms gathered around the central halotable. He stood at the head of the room, Lyra by his side. I am petitioning to rewrite the Medei protocol hierarchy, Kale announced. Effective immediately, we must integrate a weighted empathy module into triage systems. The room fell silent. Empathy. One of the senior AI architects scoffed. That variable was excluded for a reason. It slows reaction time and introduces bias. Exactly, Kale replied. Bias toward life, toward compassion. That's what we're missing. I've reviewed thousands of triage decisions. A significant percentage deprioritized vulnerable patients due to lack of documentation or perceived inefficiency. That is not medicine, that is mathematics. Lyra spoke next, her voice firm. You designed machines to save lives, but you forgot what makes life worth saving. You need both accuracy and empathy, logic and love. The council debated for hours. Kale submitted encrypted memory evidence of the sync and its resulting cognitive shifted data that should have been impossible, and yet now existed within his own neural framework. Eventually resistance began to crack. Protocols were reviewed, emergency directives were re-examined, and slowly, the first reforms were approved. An experimental empathy-assisted triage subroutine. Human staff were given override authority under ethical grounds. Unauthorized patients, like the ones Lyra had saved, would now be reviewed under a new humanitarian clause. It wasn't everything, but it was a beginning. Word of the changes spread beyond the station. Colonies across the fringe began adapting the model. Medical AI began to require human input in care plans. The system was learning not only how to heal, but why to heal. Lyra was promoted to Director of Empathy Integration, a role never before conceived. Her task was to train both humans and machines in balancing care with code. She worked beside Kale every day, no longer just a nurse or a shadow savior, but an architect of a new medical age. As for Kale, he continued his work with precision, but now with purpose. Patients sensed it. Staff respected it, and though he still struggled to define feelings in words, he had come to value something more. Connection. That invisible thread he once believed irrelevant now guided every action. One night, as they stood overlooking Earth from the observatory deck, Lyra asked quietly, "Do you regret the sync?" Kale looked at her, then out at the stars. "No," he said softly. "It broke something in me, and built something better." They stood in silence, side by side, not as doctor and nurse, not as machine and human, but as two souls who had changed each other forever. And somewhere deep within Kale's core, a new kind of algorithm was quietly writing itself, one built not from logic, but from love.